A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Hannah sent us something interesting this week. She's been thinking about Turkey, and she wrote in saying, "I'm very curious about Turkey. I've been on a few trips there over the last 10 or 15 years, and it's left quite an impression on me. Namely, that it seems like an obvious ally for Israel. I felt a deep cultural connection, and it seems like a much more obvious friend for Israel than Western Europe. It's close by. Israelis love traveling there. They have a deep history of music, food, and culture, and they're also a bridge between East and West, and not Arab. Is there any chance that Turkey will return to a more secular posture? Is there any chance of the more modern leaders, many of whom I believe Erdogan has had arrested on trumped-up charges, coming to power and overthrowing Erdogan and his ilk? It just really felt like there's a large, relatively secular and modern population that just wants to have a nice life and would fit in quite well in Tel Aviv. I also wonder about the feeling of people on the street about Israel. I expected a lot of antagonism, but was surprised that most people I spoke to didn't seem to really know anything about Israel. They were completely apathetic."
That is such a sharp observation from Hannah, especially that bit about the apathy on the street. It hits on the massive disconnect between the fiery ideological rhetoric coming out of Ankara and the actual lived reality of the Turkish people.
It's a great prompt. And by the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. Herman Poppleberry, I feel like you've been waiting for an excuse to talk about the sick man of Europe and its modern identity crisis. Where do we even start with this paradox? Because, on one hand, you have Erdogan calling Israel a terrorist state, and on the other, you have millions of Turks who just want to drink espresso in Kadıköy and listen to indie rock.
The paradox is the whole story, Corn. We are looking at a country that was the first Muslim-majority nation to recognize Israel back in 1949. For decades, they were the silent pillars of regional stability. They shared intelligence, they did joint military exercises, and they basically acted as the ultimate buffer against radicalism in the Middle East. But since 2003, under Recep Tayyip Erdogan and his Justice and Development Party, or the AKP, we've seen this systematic dismantling of that secular pro-Western foundation.
Right, and Hannah mentioned the culture. If you go to the secular districts of Istanbul, like Besiktas or Kadıköy, it really does feel like the Tel Aviv of the north. The tech scene, the nightlife, the Mediterranean food culture. It's the same DNA. So why does the government seem so hell-bent on burning that bridge?
It comes down to what I call the Erdogan doctrine. For Erdogan, Israel isn't just a foreign policy issue, it's his most effective domestic mobilization tool. Whenever he needs to shore up his conservative Islamist base, he reaches for the Palestinian cause. It's a way to position himself as the neo-Ottoman leader of the Muslim world. But as Hannah noticed, that top-down hostility doesn't always filter down to the average Turk in the way you'd expect.
That's what's wild. You'd think with the state media blasting anti-Israel propaganda 24/7, there would be mobs in the street. But she's saying people were just indifferent. Is that because they're tuned out, or is it a quiet form of rebellion against the state narrative?
It's a mix of both. There is a massive silent majority in Turkey, estimated at 30 to 40%, that favors neutrality or at least pragmatism over active hostility. Recent data from the 24 Conda polls showed that 68% of Turks under 35 actually support normalization with Israel. The youth are skeptical of the AKP's Islamist rhetoric. They care about the fact that the Turkish lira has collapsed, that inflation is astronomical, and that their European travel dreams are slipping away. To them, Picking a fight with Israel feels like an expensive hobby for an aging autocrat.
Speaking of autocrats, Hannah asked about the modern leaders being arrested. She's clearly talking about Ekrem İmamoğlu, the mayor of Istanbul. What's the latest on his situation? Because he seems like the great secular hope for a lot of people.
It's pretty grim right now. As of early 26, İmamoğlu is tied up in a web of legal battles that most international observers say are completely manufactured. He was sentenced to over 2 years in prison on charges of insulting public officials because he called the people who annulled his initial election victory fools. The courts are moving to uphold a political ban against him, which would prevent him from running in the 28 presidential election. Erdogan knows that in a fair fight, İmamoğlu represents the secular, modern Turkey that Hannah experienced, the Turkey that wants to be a bridge, not a wall.
So Erdogan is basically using the judiciary as a personal gatekeeper. If you're too popular and too secular, you get a political ban. It's an effective way to keep the opposition in a defensive crouch. But does the opposition actually have the spine to change the Israel policy if they did win? Or is the Israel-Palestine issue too radioactive even for them?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question. The CHP, which is the main opposition party, is in a tough spot. Personally, many of their leaders are very pragmatic and would love to restore the silent alliance with Israel. They see the economic benefits, but they're terrified of being labeled Zionist puppets by Erdogan's media machine, so they play it very safe. They'll criticize the humanitarian situation in Gaza to keep their flank protected, even if their ultimate goal is a return to a Kemalist, pro-Western foreign policy.
It's a tightrope walk. But let's look at the numbers for a second, because money usually talks louder than rhetoric. Even with all the shouting, what was the trade situation like before the recent freeze?
This is where the hypocrisy gets really interesting. Despite the diplomatic shouting matches, bilateral trade actually reached $8.5 billion in 2024. Turkey was a major supplier of cement, steel, and textiles to Israel. It took until May of 2024 for Erdogan to announce a total halt of trade, and even now, there's a massive ghost trade happening. Turkish goods are being transshipped through Greece, Romania, or even through Palestinian intermediaries to get into the Israeli market. The two economies are deeply interdependent. Turkish hoteliers were devastated in the 24 and 25 seasons when Israeli tourism dropped by 90%. Those business owners are a powerful lobby, and they aren't ideologues, they're capitalists.
So you have this economic backdoor keeping things alive while the front door is slammed shut and locked. It's almost like a dysfunctional marriage where they're still sharing a bank account but refusing to speak at dinner.
That's a perfect way to put it. And it's not just trade, it's energy. The Eastern Mediterranean has these massive gas deposits. The most logical way to get that gas to Europe is a pipeline through Turkey. But because of the political freeze, Israel has leaned into a trilateral partnership with Greece and Cyprus instead. Turkey is effectively cutting itself out of a generational economic windfall just to maintain Erdogan's ideological purity.
That feels like a massive strategic blunder. If you're a young Turk looking at your bank account, and you see that your government is blocking a pipeline that could stabilize the economy just to make a point about a conflict hundreds of miles away, you're going to be frustrated. Is that why Hannah felt that apathy? Like, I've got bigger problems than this?
Precisely. For the urban secular population, the Israel-Palestine conflict is a tragedy, sure, but it's also a distraction. They see Erdogan using it to bypass discussions about the fact that the lira lost 30% of its value in 2025 alone. There's a sense of exhaustion. They've been told for 20 years that the Zionist lobby is responsible for all their woes, and they just don't buy it anymore.
Let's talk about the cultural bridge she mentioned, the music and food. I mean, Mizrahi music in Israel is basically built on a Turkish foundation. You have icons like Ibrahim Tatlisi's, who are huge in Israel. Does that cultural undercurrent actually matter when the politics are this toxic?
It's the cultural glue that keeps the relationship from shattering completely. You can't easily erase decades of shared aesthetic. When an Israeli goes to Istanbul, they don't feel like they're in a foreign, hostile land. They feel like they're in a slightly more chaotic version of home, and vice versa. There's a shared Mediterranean temperament, but culture can only do so much heavy lifting when the state institutions are being captured.
You mentioned the institutional capture. We should probably dig into that because it's not just the arrests of politicians. It's the media and the schools too, right?
It's comprehensive. Since the failed coup in 26, Erdogan has purged tens of thousands of civil servants, judges, and academics. He's passed disinformation laws, like the one in 2025, that basically make it a crime to criticize the government's foreign policy on social media. If you tweet that Turkey should normalize relations with Israel for economic reasons, you could technically be charged with spreading state-weakening propaganda. That creates a climate of fear that suppresses the modern Turkey Hannah is talking about.
So the apathy she saw might actually be a survival mechanism. If you don't know anything and you don't care, you can't get in trouble.
That is a very incisive point, Korn. Silence is a form of safety in an increasingly authoritarian state, but the pressure cooker is getting hot. The 26 local elections are coming up, and they are going to be a massive bellwether. If the CHP and the opposition can hold on to Istanbul and Ankara despite the legal threats against Imamoglu, it shows that the secular resistance is still alive.
But how does Erdogan keep winning? I mean, if the economy is in the toilet and the youth hate the rhetoric, how does he maintain the grip?
He's a master of the identity war. He frames every election as a choice between the people, meaning his conservative religious base, and the elites, the secularists who he claims want to sell the country out to the West and Israel. He uses state resources to tilt the playing field. It's not a full-blown dictatorship like North Korea, but it's a competitive autocracy. You can vote, but the guy in charge owns the scoreboard and the referees.
It's the illiberal democracy model. But let's look at the regional shifts. In Syria, things are changing. Assad is weakened, there's a vacuum in the north. Does that force Israel and Turkey back together? Because they both hate Iranian influence in Syria, right?
You'd think so, but it's actually become a new friction point. Turkey views northern Syria as its own backyard, a place to manage the Kurdish groups they consider terrorists. Israel views that same vacuum through the lens of stopping Iranian proxies. In 2025, we saw them move from silent allies to strategic rivals in that space. They're competing for influence over the same pieces of the chessboard. Instead of teaming up against Iran, they're suspicious of each other's long-term goals.
So even the enemy of my enemy logic is failing because they don't trust each other's post-Assad vision. That's a bleak outlook for the obvious ally theory.
It is bleak in the short term, but Hannah's intuition about the long term is actually backed by a lot of geopolitical thinkers. Turkey is essentially a lonely power right now. It's a NATO member, but the West doesn't trust Erdogan. It wants to lead the Muslim world, but Arab nations like Egypt and Saudi Arabia are wary of Turkey's neo-Ottoman ambitions. Israel is also in a lonely position. Historically, lonely powers in the Middle East eventually find each other. It's a marriage of necessity.
The Lonely Hearts Club of the Levant. I like it. So, if we look at the path forward, what would it actually take for a pivot back to secularism? Is it just waiting for Erdogan to retire, or is the AKP machine too deep now?
The machine is deep, but it's tied very closely to Erdogan's personal charisma. There isn't a clear successor who can hold that coalition together. If the opposition can survive the current wave of arrests and keep their base energized, the modern Turkey could re-emerge very quickly. We saw this in Egypt post-Morsi. Once the ideological fever broke, the state bureaucracy and the military were very quick to pivot back to a pragmatic, if cold, relationship with Israel.
So there's a deep state in Turkey that might actually prefer the old way.
The diplomatic corps, the high-ranking military officers, and the big business leaders. They all know that the current path is unsustainable. They want access to Israeli tech, they want the gas pipeline, and they want to be back in the good graces of Washington. They're just waiting for the current captain to leave the bridge.
Let's talk about the Tel Aviv of the North idea again. Hannah said these people would fit in quite well in Tel Aviv. I think that's such a poignant observation because it highlights that this isn't a conflict between peoples, it's a conflict between a specific government and a state. If you took the government out of the equation, the two populations would probably be hanging out at the beach together within a week.
They basically were until 2008. Before the 1-minute incident at Davos and the Mavi Marmara, the Mediterranean was an Israeli-Turkish playground. You had hundreds of flights a week. The cultural exchange was seamless. What's scary is how quickly a leader can dismantle that. It takes decades to build trust and about 6 months of inflammatory speeches to burn it down.
And once it's burned, you have a whole generation of kids in both countries growing up only knowing the rivalry version. That's the real tragedy. If you're 20 years old in Istanbul today, you've never known a Turkey that wasn't at odds with Israel.
That's why the 25 survey data is so hopeful. Despite only knowing the rivalry version, these kids are still looking at Israel and saying, wait, why are we fighting them again? They have a high-tech economy, they're secular, and they're right there. The internet has made it much harder for Erdogan to maintain a total information monopoly. A kid in Katakoy can see what life is like in Tel Aviv via TikTok, and they realize they have more in common with a developer in Israel than they do with a religious extremist in their own country's interior.
It's the digital secularism. You can't hide the lifestyle anymore. So the apathy Hannah saw might actually be a sign of the propaganda failing. People are just like, yeah, Israel is the devil, whatever. Can I get a job?
Apathy is the first step toward the rejection of an ideological narrative. If the state wants you to be angry and you're just bored, the state is losing.
So, looking at the practical side for our listeners, what should they be watching if they want to see which way the wind is blowing?
First, watch the legal case of Ekrem Imamoglu. If the political ban is finalized and he's removed from office, it's a sign that Erdogan is going into full survival mode, which usually means doubling down on the anti-Israel rhetoric to distract from the domestic outcry. Second, watch the trade numbers. If the ghost trade through third countries starts to get shut down, it means the ideological wing of the AKP is winning over the pragmatic business wing.
And what about the media? Is there any independent Turkish media left that isn't just a mouthpiece for Ankara?
It's tough, but there are outlets like Duvar English or Mediascope that do incredible work under immense pressure. They give you a window into that other Turkey, the one Hannah felt. If you only read the headlines from official agencies, you're only getting half the story.
I also think it's worth tracking the Israel-Greece-Cyprus triangle. If Turkey starts making overtures to join that energy architecture, it's the biggest signal of a pivot. They can't do that without normalizing with Israel first.
That would be the grand bargain. But as of April 26, Erdogan seems more interested in his legacy as a defender of the faith than as an economic reformer. He's thinking about his place in history books, not his place in a gas pipeline.
It's the classic autocrat's trap. You start believing your own press releases.
And you lose sight of the fact that your most modern, productive citizens are looking for the exit. We've seen a massive brain drain from Turkey over the last few years. The doctors, engineers, and artists, the people who would fit in Tel Aviv, are moving to Berlin, London, and New York. Erdogan is winning the political battle but losing the future of his country.
That's a heavy realization. You can keep the land and the throne, but if all the talent leaves, what are you actually ruling over?
You're ruling over a museum of your own grievances.
Man, that's dark. But let's bring it back to Hannah's experience. She felt that deep cultural connection. I think that's the most important takeaway. Politics are a layer on top of a much older foundation. Empires come and go, Erdogans come and go, but the geography and the culture don't change. Turkey and Israel are neighbors in a very small, very crowded neighborhood. Eventually they have to talk.
It reminds me of the bridge metaphor Hannah used. Turkey's traditional role was being the bridge between East and West. Under Erdogan, the bridge has been closed for repairs, or maybe it's been turned into a fortress. But the foundation of the bridge is still there. It's built on secularism, on a desire for modernity, and on a shared Mediterranean identity.
So, to answer her question, is there any chance Turkey will return to a more secular posture?
I would say it's not just a chance, it's an eventual certainty. The demographics and the economics demand it. The only question is how much damage is done in the meantime. Does it take another 5 years or another 20? And does a leader like Imamoglu get the chance to lead, or does a new generation of secular leaders have to emerge from the wreckage of the AKP era?
And what about the street feeling? If you were an Israeli going to Turkey today, not that many are, would you actually be safe?
Statistically, yes. Most of the antagonism is performative and state-led. As Hannah found, the average person in the street is dealing with their own life. If you aren't walking around with a giant flag looking for a fight, you're going to find the same Turkish hospitality that has existed for centuries. The apathy she observed is actually a weird kind of shield.
It's protective indifference. I think we've really unpacked the layers here. We've got the Erdogan doctrine, the Imamoglu legal drama, the ghost trade, and the silent majority. It's a lot more complex than Turkey hates Israel. It's more like the Turkish state is using Israel as a pawn in a domestic chess game, while the Turkish people are trying to play a completely different game.
That is exactly it. And for those who want to dive deeper, I really recommend following the work of the Brookings Institution on the Eastern Med. They've done some incredible data-driven pieces on why the economic high point and the political low point are happening at the same time. It's a fascinating study in cognitive dissonance.
I love that. A study in cognitive dissonance. That could be the tagline for the whole region, honestly.
Guilty as charged. But what I find truly wild is that despite everything, the two countries still haven't officially severed diplomatic ties. They've recalled ambassadors, they've downgraded relations, but the embassies are still there. The lights are on. It's like they're keeping the line open just in case someone sane picks up the phone.
They're ghosting each other, but they haven't blocked the number yet.
They're waiting for a read receipt that isn't an insult.
Well, I think we've given Anna a lot to chew on. It's a nuanced situation, and her boots-on-the-ground intuition was remarkably accurate. The apathy is real, the secular population is real, and the institutional capture is the only thing standing in the way of a massive regional realignment.
It's a waiting game now. And in the Middle East, the waiting games can last for generations, or they can end in a weekend.
Hopefully, it's the weekend version. I'd love to see that pipeline get built.
Me too. Think of what that would do for the regional economy. It would be a game changer for everyone involved.
Well, on that hopeful-ish note, I think we can wrap this one up. It's been a deep dive into the sick man's modern heart.
It's a heart that's still beating, Corn, just needs some better medicine.
And maybe a new doctor. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the wheels on this bus.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that powered this show. We couldn't do these deep dives without that horsepower.
If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach new listeners. It really does make a difference.
This has been My Weird Prompts.
We'll see you next time.
Goodbye.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash, text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow